NATO just drew its hardest red line since the Cold War ended, and Vladimir Putin pushed them past it with 21 Russian military drones crossing into Polish airspace in a single night. The alliance's response has been swift, unprecedented, and absolutely decisive. Operation Eastern Sentry isn't just another military exercise. It's NATO's declaration that Russian airspace violations will trigger immediate multinational military response. The Cold War rules of engagement just got rewritten, and Putin is about to discover that testing NATO unity was the biggest strategic mistake of his career. The scope of NATO's Eastern Sentry operation reveals an alliance that has moved beyond diplomatic protest to preparation for active military confrontation with Russia. NATO has launched an Eastern Sentry to bolster the defense of Europe's eastern flank following Russia's drone breach of Poland's airspace earlier this week. Secretary General Mark Rutte announced Friday. This is a reactive positioning. This is proactive preparation for the next Russian escalation that NATO leadership clearly believes is inevitable. The international coalition assembling for Eastern Sentry represents the most serious Western military mobilization since the Yugoslav Wars. The Eastern Sentry operation will commence in the coming days and will involve assets from Denmark, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and others, Rutte said. When NATO's most powerful members are simultaneously deploying military assets to confront Russian aggression, we're witnessing the militarization of a crisis that could explode into direct NATO-Russia conflict within days. The original drone incident that triggered Eastern Sentry was far more serious than initial reports suggested, representing the first direct Russian military attack on NATO territory since the alliance's founding. Last night, numerous drones from Russia violated Polish airspace. Our air defenses were activated and successfully ensured the defense of NATO territory, as they are designed to do. Several allies were involved alongside Poland. This included Polish F-16S, Dutch F-35S, Italian AWACS, NATO multinational coordination that demonstrated both Russian aggression and NATO's readiness for immediate collective response. The military assets being deployed for Eastern Sentry reveal NATO's preparation for sustained air warfare against Russian drone operations and potentially much more serious threats. Operation Eastern Sentry will see Rafales, Eurofighters, more F-16s, and air defense frigate help protect Poland from future Russian drone incursions. These aren't defensive patrol aircraft. These are some of the world's most advanced fighter jets equipped for air-to-air combat and deep strike missions that could target Russian territory if necessary. The scale of Russian provocation that prompted Eastern Sentry was massive and clearly coordinated, representing Putin's most dangerous test of NATO resolve since the Ukraine invasion began. Polish airspace was violated by at least 19 Russian drones overnight, the country's prime minister said, in a torrent of activity that triggered a response from the NATO country's Air Force, which scrambled and downed several of the drones. 19 simultaneous drone violations don't happen by accident. This was deliberate military escalation designed to test whether NATO would respond with force. The historic significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Polish and NATO forces have now engaged Russian military assets in direct combat for the first time since World War II. Fighter jets were scrambled early on Wednesday as more than a dozen drones entered Polish airspace, the Polish military said. It is the first time that Polish and NATO forces have become engaged in the conflict. We've crossed a line from proxy war to direct military confrontation, and Eastern Sentry represents NATO's commitment to escalate rather than de-escalate this new phase of conflict. The diplomatic framework reveals that Eastern Sentry was designed specifically to deter further Russian violations while demonstrating alliance solidarity at a level that Putin cannot ignore. Following the violation of Polish airspace by at least 19 Russian drones earlier this week, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has announced an Eastern Sentry program, which aims to deter further Russian incursions and show solidarity with Poland. But deterrence only works if the threat is credible, and Eastern Sentry's military composition suggests NATO is prepared for actual combat operations. The Article 4 invocation adds legal and political weight that transforms Eastern Sentry from a military exercise into a formal alliance response to Russian aggression. Marcin Przydacz, the Polish presidential advisor on international affairs, also confirmed that 21 drones have crossed into Polish airspace. Poland, Prime Minister Donald Tusk requested the invocation of Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty. When Article 4 consultations result in immediate multinational military deployments, we're seeing NATO's collective defense mechanisms operating at maximum effectiveness. The operational language coming from NATO leadership reveals an alliance that has moved beyond diplomatic solutions to preparation for military confrontation. NATO fighter jets shot down multiple Russian drones that violated Polish airspace during an attack on neighboring Ukraine early on Wednesday, as a military alliance denounced Moscow for absolutely dangerous behavior that ratcheted up tensions to a new level. Absolutely dangerous represents NATO diplomatic language for behavior that justifies military response. The immediate implementation timeline for Eastern Century demonstrates alliance urgency that suggests intelligence warnings about further Russian escalation. "We can't have Russian drones entering Allied airspace," he told a press conference announcing Operation Eastern Century. The mission, which begins on Friday evening, will involve a range of assets integrating air and ground bases. Allies, including Denmark, France, Britain, and Germany, have committed forces. When NATO operations begin within 48 hours of announcement, the alliance is responding to imminent rather than theoretical threats. The formal military structure behind Eastern Century reveals sophisticated planning that goes far beyond reactive deployment to proactive preparation for expanded conflict. On Friday, September 12, 2025, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and Supreme Allied Commander Europe SACEUR, General Alexis G. Grinkwich held a joint press conference to outline NATO's response to the violation of Polish airspace by Russian drones 2 days earlier. When SACEUR personally announces military operations, NATO is treating this crisis at the highest levels of strategic importance. The strategic implications extend beyond defending Polish airspace to establishing new precedents for NATO response to Russian aggression anywhere along the eastern flank. NATO has launched an initiative to reinforce the defense of Europe's eastern flank after a Russian drone incursion into Polish airspace this week, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte announced on Friday. This isn't just about Poland. This is about establishing NATO's red lines for the entire Russian border from the Baltics to the Black Sea. The multi-domain nature of Eastern Century reveals NATO preparation for comprehensive warfare that could include cyber, space, and conventional operations against Russian assets. NATO has announced the launch of Eastern Century, a new multi-domain activity aimed at strengthening the alliance's posture along its eastern flank, following the violation of Polish airspace by Russian drones on September 10th. Multi-domain operations represent the highest level of NATO military planning, suggesting preparation for a full-spectrum conflict rather than limited defensive measures. The timing reveals that NATO leadership views Putin's drone operation as the beginning of systematic Russian testing of alliance resolve rather than an isolated incident. Eastern Century's immediate implementation suggests intelligence assessments that Russian escalation will continue and potentially expand to other alliance members. NATO is positioning for a sustained military confrontation rather than a single defensive response. The aircraft deployment for Eastern Century includes some of the world's most advanced fighter jets capable of both defensive and offensive operations deep into Russian territory. Rafale's Eurofighters and F-35s aren't just interceptors. They're multi-role fighters capable of precision strikes against targets hundreds of miles inside Russia. NATO is deploying offensive capabilities under the cover of defensive operations. The naval component adds another dimension that could threaten Russian operations in the Baltic and Black Seas. An air defense frigate provides both defensive coverage and offensive strike capabilities that could target Russian naval assets supporting drone operations. This naval deployment suggests NATO is prepared to expand operations beyond airspace defense to maritime confrontation. The intelligence implications are staggering. Eastern Century represents NATO's conclusion that Russian aggression requires immediate military response rather than diplomatic solutions. The alliance has essentially declared that Putin's regime cannot be deterred through traditional means and must face direct military confrontation to prevent further escalation. The ultimate question isn't whether Eastern Century will deter Russian aggression. Putin has already demonstrated his willingness to attack NATO territory despite knowing the consequences. The question is whether NATO's new military posture will prevent escalation to larger conflicts or accelerate the timeline toward direct NATO-Russia warfare that could engulf Europe in the largest military conflict since World War II.